everyone, my name is Hunter May. I am the owner of May Crochets, and this is the second video to my how to design pattern series. So the very first video, we talked about how you make a gauge and how you measure it and block it accordingly. And then we talked about how to calculate the rows and stitches needed based off of that gauge to then the project size that we want to create. And then we also talked about how to estimate yardage for the pattern as well. So if you want to know all about that, definitely go watch the first video. But in this video, we're going to be talking about how to actually write our patterns. And for this video, I'm going to be using this test pattern of a kitchen like washcloth, a kitchen towel, and a pot holder, but I ran out of yarn, so I didn't actually make the pot holder, but we'll write the pattern anyways.
Hello, so we're switching over to my computer right now. We are going to be fully writing the pattern together, so I'm sorry if it looks a little bit interesting. This is my first time ever doing this, but we're gonna do it together. The very first thing to know is that we have a few things that we need to know in every single pattern that we make. Regardless of whatever the pattern is, each pattern needs these specific things every time. So I guess I should mention before we dive in, I'm using Notion. So I love Notion and I use it just to basically just write down all the notes of a pattern, make it basic. We're not making it pretty right now. We're not including any pictures. We're just straight up putting the information. And then once all this information is filled out, then I'll look at and show you my PDFs and how I do that as well. But for now, we're just going to write down all the pattern's information and write the pattern. So we first need what materials we need to create this pattern. And I have it over on my right screen just to save us some time of me typing everything out. So I'm going to paste it here. So we need the size of hook or size of knitting needles that we're going to be using. And it's always a really good idea to put the millimeters or the US size both on there. It's just super helpful. I follow so many patterns where they'll have just the millimeter and I have to go look up what size that is in US or vice versa. So I recommend always put the 2 units of measure, even though it's annoying. Then your customers are going to be really happy following your pattern because they don't have to look it up, specifically with like yards and meters and things like that. So when it comes to materials, we want to tell our customers exactly what they're going to need to make our pattern. So number 1, our crochet hook or needle size. Then we need the yarn. What yarn can they use for this pattern? So for my pattern right here, they need a weight for cotton yarn. Cotton is very important for this pattern. I always put what yarn I use specifically, but I never make my patterns like have to be a specific yarn. We don't really like that. And then this pattern is technically 3 patterns in one. So I put the amount of yarn, the yardage or meterage that each of those are going to need. So if you have a sweater that is extra small through 5X, you're going to want to put the yardage or meterage for every single size in your material section. And then lastly, I put scissors. You could also put like a tapestry needle, whatever they need to make the pattern. Now let's look at the gauge information. The gauge is super important to make sure that the customer knows that their yarn, their size of hook, needle with the stitch that you're making is going to result in the same size that you say the pattern should end up being. So for the gauge information for my pattern, mine is 14 rows by 14 stitches, is 4 inches on the rows and 3.75 inches in the stitches. And then always include the centimeters as well, super helpful. And then we also want to put the stitch that the gauge is made from. So for me, mine uses the grit stitch. And when you're using a special stitch or a special technique, we need to add that to the special stitches section. And whenever I mention a stitch that will be mentioned in the special stitches section, I will write something like this to say, see special stitches. That way they know that they can find that definition in my pattern versus having to go YouTube it, Google it somewhere else. they can find it directly in my pattern. So now, stitch abbreviation. This is a glossary of the shorthand versions of the stitches that we're going to reference later in the instructions, but we want to put a super nice glossary for people. That way they know when we say SC, that means a single crochet. They don't have to frustratingly go to Google and search up what this means. They have the glossary already in our pattern. Your abbreviations might be completely different than what my abbreviations are. That's why it's good to put a glossary in your pattern. That way we are specifically telling our customers how we write patterns. So those are all my stitch abbreviations that I'm going to use in the instructions that I can think of right now. My one tip for stitch abbreviations is usually there's like the general always going to use in a pattern, like fasten off, stitches. I always use those. So I will automatically throw those in the stitch abbreviations right away. But when I start writing my pattern, if I come up to a stitch abbreviation that I don't have written in the glossary yet, I basically stop what I'm doing and I go write it in. That way I don't forget to do it later. The order that we do this as well totally depends kind of on preference. I tend to like my sizes more up here. That way people know here's the materials and they can kind of closely see, okay, what size do I want to make though? So size information, I have what size my pot holder, my washcloth, and my kitchen towel are. And I made sure to include the centimeters in that as well, not just the inches. And that is just super helpful for customers all over the world. Let's go to the notes. Notes are essentially anything you want to say early on before people dive into the instructions. It can include little tips. I'm going to include one here. I'll just paste them in. This one of make sure that you put a single crochet in the turning chain and you don't miss that. This other tip here is to make sure that you're using cotton for this pattern. You could have so many things in your notes. It's all very specific to the pattern that you're writing. It's just a good idea to have a little section of a couple tips and notes you can give to your customer. One thing I will say is I would not make this a huge section because customers don't like reading. Faith, I don't like reading. And I know customers definitely don't like reading. So you don't want to make it an overwhelmingly large section because they're not going to read it. So put the most important things in there. So now let's do our special stitches. And my special stitch, I literally only used essentially one stitch pattern on these patterns. And that pattern is the grit stitch. So we're going to write the instructions of the grit stitch. And because my pattern is very simple, you know, it's just a square of this stitch, what we write for the special stitches is basically going to be the instructions as well. Besides the fact that the instructions are going to include exact row and stitch amounts for the 3 projects that we're making. So let's write the special stitch of the grit stitch. This is how I write my instructions here. You definitely don't have to do it this way. There's no right or wrong. So for this specific stitch, you need to chain, which I'm going to use my CH abbreviation, a multiple of 2 plus 1 to be able to even start. One thing I will say too is some people will put the chain instruction before row 1 as kind of like a foundation, and then row 1 is working off of the chain. It's totally preference. I include the chain with the row 1 instruction just because I have noticed that if you have the chain above the row 1, some people miss that. I have missed it multiple times because I just look for that row 1 instruction and skip everything sometimes. So I make sure to include it in the row instruction just so it doesn't get missed. All right, and then we're going to chain 2, and that's going to be our turning chain. So that's our chaining instructions. So for this stitch specifically, you have to chain a multiple of 2 plus 1, and then chain an additional 2 for the turning chain. So when it comes to crochet, something that's good to do is tell them which chain to work into first. So unlike knitting, you just kind of knit across, but with crochet, you might need to start in the second chain from the hook or so on. So for this one, I'm going to say skip 2. So we're skipping 2 chains, and then we're going to double crochet, which is DC, in the next chain. So we're skipping 2, double crocheting in the next chain. It looks crazy, but if you think about, we're going up to our stitch abbreviations and like plugging them in, it makes sense. Now we're going to do a repeat instruction. So there's tons of different ways people do repeat instructions. There's definitely no right or wrong way. This is the way I do it. So I surround with asterisks where the repeats are. Some people do like the brackets like this. Some people do curly braces. Some people do parentheses. There are so many different ways. I like asterisks, so that's what I'm gonna do. So with our repeat instruction, we're gonna skip, which we know that means skip the next stitch, and then single crochet SC and DC in the same stitch. We're gonna end the repeat. So we're skipping a stitch, single crochet, double crochet in the same stitch, skip, single crochet, double crochet in the same stitch, back and forth. And then I'm gonna say how long they need to repeat it. So I'm gonna say repeat from this asterisk to this asterisk. You could also say between these two things, from this to this. There's a lot of different ways to write it. It's always good to say like, you're gonna go from here to here though. It's just a little bit easier to read. And then I'm gonna say repeat from that to that until 2 stitches, which is my STS for me. It's scary, I know. It's a lot. It's a lot to figure out how to write, but we're doing it together. We're gonna learn. And then at the end, we're gonna skip a stitch, single crochet, and turn. That's our row 1 instruction. So now we're gonna do our row 2. So row 2, we're gonna chain 1, and then I'm gonna leave a note that says this counts as the first single crochet, which that could be something that I write in the notes instead, just kind of preference of where you want to put that note. I prefer it written here because in notes, it could be easily missed. And then we're going to double crochet in the first stitch. And then we're going to start a repeat of skip, single crochet, and double crochet in the same stitch, and the repeat, and repeat from that to that until 1 stitch before the turn of the chain. So I'm using ST for stitch, I'm using CH for chain, and then we're gonna skip, single crochet in turning chain, and then turn. So there's our second row instruction. And then I'm going to put a note right after here that just says repeat row 2 until the desired height. That's our special stitch. That's how you do the grit stitch. And that's just kind of how you write patterns. Kind of hard to explain how you write a pattern. There's no right way to do it. Everyone develops their own style. I followed a lot of patterns before I felt comfortable enough to write my own. It just comes with a lot of knowledge of writing patterns. Just practice. Honestly, if you want to start writing your own patterns, find a pattern online that is pretty basic. The cat beanies are pretty easy. They're just like in the round and then you sew up top. Write a super simple pattern for that. And maybe have someone review it for you, or just practice writing it and you'll slowly get the hang of it. You're gonna have issues. You're gonna run into things, but that's okay. It happens. So these are all our super important things that we need at the beginning of a pattern. We haven't even gotten into the instructions yet. So a little bit about my method in how I write patterns. Usually I have some rough notes or I have like an Excel spreadsheet that I work off of that I kind of threw all the calculations in maybe did some rough instructions, and then I usually try to write it based on that. And then once I convert all my scratch notes into all the instructions, I kind of like review it through Notion, and then I'll add it to my PDF and make it actually look pretty. And then that's where I review it, revise it, make it look good, read through it, make sure there's no grammar issues, things like that. And then you have other people test it, and that's where testers come in. They're so amazing and they help a lot. Or even like a tech editor. Just remember, it's not going to be perfect right away. That's why we have so many steps of the pattern process. I've been writing patterns for almost 3 years now, which is crazy. You just get better as you go. Since my pattern has different sizes, I'm going to create like a little, what would be the word? Kind of like a glossary of like how they can read the rows and stitches throughout this pattern. So I'm going to say that I'm going to put the washcloth instructions here, the pot holder instructions here, and the kitchen towel instructions here. Since it's mostly just a square, I can easily repurpose my instructions for each of the items, and that's really helpful to make a shorter pattern. Shorter patterns mean easier to read, more user-friendly, not as intimidating. It's always good to shorten it as much as we can, but in a way that's still going to make it understandable, readable, clear, and all that good stuff. So those are my sizes on the instructions. So row 1, for every single one, all 3 of them, we're going to do basically the grit stitch. So I'm just going to copy this right here and paste it. But we're going to get rid of the instruction on how many to chain, and now we're going to actually tell them what they need to chain. So this comes with our gauge and figuring out those rows and stitches that we needed for each of those sizes. So I used my pattern planner here. I'll show you a quick glimpse of it. This is a paid Excel spreadsheet that I have available on my shop. I'll link it down below. I'll move my face a little bit. With this Excel spreadsheet, you're able to put all the information that we basically did in the first video, and it'll do it all for you. So here are all the sizes that I want my finished items to be. Here's my gauge information. Here's my yarn yardage and grams of the yarn that I used. And then this Excel spreadsheet will calculate the stitches and rows I need based on all that information. And then if you calculate the area of each size as well, it'll also give you the yardage or meterage depending on what unit of measure you input, all for you. And you didn't have to do any math yourself, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to be using this to help with knowing the stitches and rows that I need for each of the sizes. So we need this information because these are our stitch amounts for each of the sizes. So for the washcloth, which is this one here, we need 36. And then I'm going to do parentheses where I'm going to put the pot holder, which is 27. And then the kitchen towel is 56. So if someone's following this pattern, they're going to see these 3 values, and they're going to say, if I'm making the washcloth, I know I need to do the first value. If I'm making the pot holder, that's the number that's right after the parentheses before the comma, which is 27. And then if they're making the kitchen towel, they know they need to follow this number. Does that make sense? And then at the end, I always like to say how many stitches they're going to have at the end. So we're going to tell them the final stitch counts, which I honestly can't remember if this is right, but we're going to say it is. That way, once they do this row, they know how many stitches they should have. And we want to keep it in the same exact format as we did here. So we have our first row instructions, how many stitches. Now we need to tell them how many rows they need to, well, I guess we need to do row 2. So row 2, it's going to be exactly the same. They're just going to be working off that first row. And then we can copy paste the final stitch amount because the final stitch amount isn't going to change. So we'll put that at the end there. Now we need to tell them how many rows they need to make for the finished item. There's two different ways we could do this. It's kind of up to preference. First, we could do row 3 through whatever. So we repeat row 2. Or we can do it here and get rid of this. Fully up to you, whatever you like to do. I feel like I swap back and forth depending on how I'm feeling, honestly. I think I'm gonna do it right here though. So row 2 through 32, 25, 88. 32, 25, 88 is how many rows they need to do of this instruction here. So row 2 through these amount of rows, they will be doing this instruction. Pretty cool, right? And my pot holder is a little bit different because I wanted it to be double-sided. So I am just going to put, we think I want to do this. Essentially, I want them, if they're making the pot holder, they need to do 2 of these. I think that makes sense. I might change it up a little bit. I guess one thing I did forget is we forgot to tell them to fasten off. So after they complete everything, we can say, we're going to fasten off and leave in the ends. Boom. And then they're going to know if they're making the pot holder, they're going to repeat it a second time where they're going to have 2 separate squares and letting them know for the pot holder specifically, you are going to have 2 separate squares of 27 stitches and 25 rows just to kind of make sure, double check we're all on the same page. And then you're going to join these 2 squares together by single crocheting around the edges. Put them together, line them up evenly, attach your yarn anywhere along the side of the squares because they're not technically a pot holder yet. And then they're going to chain 1 and single crochet in each stitch because they're working across stitches. But then also each row, because the row is different, and then slip stitch into the first single crochet and fasten off. But we do not have slip stitch in our stitch abbreviations. So now we're going to come up and add it. And I guess I forgot to mention, I put my stitch abbreviations in alphabetical order to make it super easy. And I had to do the alphabet in my head quick for slip stitch. We're done with our pattern. So now that we're fully done, we have all the information. Now it's time for the actual making the PDF and what that should look like. Okay, so now that we have our pattern all written and it looks beautiful, let's talk a little bit about how we make the PDF and just some tips. I just want to kind of go over this fairly quickly. So here is my template that I have for all my patterns. I copied this, I made it on Canva. I love Canva. You can just easily move things around, super great. So here is my template. I gave myself a lot of like first page options because it kind of depends on what the pattern is. And then next is my little measurement section. Then all the information we did at the beginning here would go here. Just for easy bullet point view, all of the highlighted headers are here, super easy to read and skim. That's specific for my made to measure, which we won't talk about here. And then this is the pattern information, which I also like to put the sizes up here. That way they can always see how I lay out my sizes. Yeah, so that's briefly kind of what it is, what my PDF looks like. And a couple things I just want to mention is that when you are making your PDF to actually sell your pattern, you want to make sure it's in a clear, readable format. So making sure you have nice bullet points and things like this, that's going to make it easy to skim and find the information that you're looking for in the pattern super easily. You also want to make your pattern a easily printable pattern. So don't make the entire background just like a blue color because printers are going to hate that. Keep the background white regardless of what you do. This beige color is pretty easy to print off. Same with this teal color. I try not to use tons of color. It's good to use some color so it can stand out and look good, but don't be using tons and tons of colors because People who print off patterns are going to be really mad at you. Keep your sections organized. So I rename all of my sections here, and I will copy and paste this when I have new sections that I need to put. And that also helps with just navigating the pattern, making it easy to read. And then you also want to just make sure your writing's good. You know, double check, read it over. Don't just assume first draft is good. Make sure you read it fully throughout, check the grammar, check your math, and that's just what makes a good pattern designer.
Okay, that is all I have for you on how to write patterns, specifically with my little examples here. Writing patterns is intimidating. I know it is, but it just takes a lot of practice and you'll get there eventually. I promise. Just keep at it, keep practicing, check out other people's patterns, and it'll help you a lot. Just remember to keep your patterns clear, easy to read, concise, printer friendly, user friendly, all of the friendliness. And I'm not going to be releasing this pattern because it's so simple, but I hope you enjoyed this little series. I'm going to be talking more about how to design patterns, so stay tuned for that and subscribe if you want to see more about that or just more from me in general. And thank you so much for watching. I really hope this helped, and I'll see you later. Bye!